Hi, happy Sunday. Here's another little episode of family history for you. I'm going to include a few pictures along so you can have a visual of the people that I'm talking about. But when I was talking to Andrew last night, he mentioned to me that he doesn't remember very many stories from my dad at all. So I thought I'm going to do this in a little more logical order, I guess, rather than just random stories. So I'm going to start with my dad and tell you a few stories about him. But to lead into that, let me read you a little bit of the history that my dad wrote, telling you some about his early childhood and to introduce you to his mother, who is Esther Fitt, which is one of the pictures that I'll enclose. And this is my dad speaking. He wrote this. He said, "My mother was married 4 times and had children by 3 of these marriages and was dead and buried at the age of 43. As I look back over my life, I can't help but think what a great vast amount of living she crowded into those 43 years. She was first married to James Abraham Powell, and they produced my dad's older brother, Bevan, who they used to call Tick for some strange reason. After my mother divorced Jim Powell, she met and married my father, John. She married John's father, who was John William Whithouse, a man of some years her senior and who had been married and had 6 children in Nebraska before he came to Utah and met and married my mother. They were married in May of 1918, and he died in the flu epidemic in October of that year, and my dad was born in December of 1918. I appeared on the scene having never met my father. My mother, after the death of John William Whithouse, was married to Alexander Major Macbeth, who owned an 80-acre farm between Price and Wellington in Utah. And that's how they happened to be in this part of the state of Utah. They farmed during the summer, and during the winter, Mr. Whithouse would go up into the mines, Alexander Major Macbeth would go into the coal mines, which were numerous at that time, and did coal mine work. He was a timber setter, and living at Standardville, Utah, where my sister Mabel was born, and my younger brother Jay was just a babe in arms when Alexander Macbeth went to work one morning. He was loading a group of rails onto this little mining car with the timbers and made ready to go back into the mine to prop up the roof and build the tracks so the rest of the men could go in and do the work. As they started in the mine, he and his companion together, a large rock fell from the roof of the mine shaft and hit one end of the rail, flipped it up in the air, and it hit him right across the side of his neck, breaking his neck. He was dead immediately, and that made my mother a widow again for the 3rd time. Well, let me stop here. That's technically not right, because she divorced her first husband. That doesn't make her a widow. Her second husband, Mr. Whithouse, died in the flu epidemic, leaving her a widow. And now Mr. Macbeth, dead in the mining accident. So again, she is a single mother for the 3rd time. So she gathered up her family, Tick, John, Mabel, Mage is what they call him, and Jay, and she took her family and moved into a house that they owned in Wellington, and they lived there for quite a time. At one time or another, she owned the little village store which was adjacent to their house. She operated that store for a while and then left the store and went back to Salt Lake City to the University of Utah to renew her teaching certificate and go into the teaching business again. That would be a little more profitable. Now remember, we're talking about really tough times in the country then. At that time in the state of Utah, it was illegal for married women to teach unless it was an emergency. And after she'd gotten out of the store business and gone back to get her certificate, it was certainly an emergency. During this time, she'd farm out her kids to relatives to take care of them while she was going to school. My dad, John, ended up spending several seasons with Aunt Ruby and her family. They lived in Willow Creek. Her husband was Uncle Wesley, and Uncle Wesley was a returned missionary, had been a coal miner his whole life. He'd come from Pennsylvania, and he knew nothing except mining. That was his occupation. But he'd been a good missionary, served in England, and he and Aunt Ruby had a nice family that were really, really good to John. And he says he remembers that this is where his early experimentation with profanity started. So here's the story. He says he'd been going to Sunday school for quite a while, and they'd been teaching the kids about not taking the name of the Lord God in vain. And he said, I thought, that's kind of strange. I don't see a lot of difference between God and shucks. I was entertaining such useful thoughts, he said, youthful, and it finally occurred to me that some words, for some reason, were bad and profane, and used in a profane manner. That's what made them bad words. But he said, I thought, why God? Are there other sacred words that are pretty good to use as swear words as well? So one afternoon, he was out in the backyard thinking about this, and because he was behind a high hedge along the side yard and there was nobody around, he thought maybe he'd do a little experimenting and see, how does this swear word thing really work? Well, here's some sacred words. Let's see. Brigham Young. That's pretty sacred. I thought, I wonder how that would sound if I used it as profanity. So he said, by Brigham Young, you're going to do this. That didn't do too much for him. So I thought, well, Joseph Smith, that's pretty sacred. I'm going to try that. By Joseph Smith, you're going to do this. And I was doing all of this out loud, he said, as if it was the proper way to swear, when from around the corner of the hedge came walking Uncle Wesley, who'd been on the other side of the hedge mowing the grass. And he could hear my dad back there practicing these swear words. And he said he was so confused about what was going on. So he finally came through the gate to see exactly what kind of deviltry my dad was up to. And John said, I had to very shamefacedly explain to him that, well, I was kind of experimenting with profanity and bad language, and I thought I'd try it out and see how it sounded and how it worked. And besides, it didn't work out very well anyway, and none of those things sounded very good. And I decided from that moment on that I really had no use for profanity in my life. But he said, I will always remember how shocked he looked when he came through that gate carrying a hoe in his hand. I thought for a minute maybe he was going to strike me with it. He was just shocked, and that's all. Okay, next week I will tell you about Mrs. Schmerzlicker's cow, because it was Aunt Ruby that sent him to give the cows the corn stalks. So there's your story for this week. Bye.